for inaugurating the conference. We are sure your speech will spark insightful discussions throughout the conference. The first session of the conference is the Reconfiguration of Global Trade and Value Chains, Trade Shocks, Trade Disruptions, and Trade Diversion. The session will begin with opening remarks from Mr. Tigran Poghosyan, President Representative of the International Monetary Fund in Mongolia. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished guest, Mr. Poghosyan, to the stage. Mr. Poghosyan, you now have the floor. Please introduce the panelists and lead the discussion.
Good morning. Welcome to our session on reconfiguration of global trade and value chains, trade shocks, trade disruptions, and trade diversion. I am Tigran Poghosyan, the IMF resident representative for Mongolia, and I will be chairing today's discussion. Before I introduce the session, let me invite our speakers. So we have 5 distinguished speakers who will address these issues from a variety of perspectives. I would like to invite them to stage. Okay, so as you know, and Governor also mentioned in his introductory speech, global trade is undergoing a fundamental transformation. Trade shocks from geopolitical tensions to pandemics, protectionism and conflict have upended long-standing assumptions about efficiency, openness and the structure of global value chains. Firms are recalibrating their sourcing strategies. Governments are recalibrating their alliances, and supply chains are being reoriented in real time. Nowhere is this shift more visible than in Asia, long considered the factory of the world. The region stands at the epicenter of this reconfiguration. On the one hand, economies like Vietnam, Indonesia, and India have emerged as beneficiaries of trade diversion, attracting investment and new manufacturing activity. On the other, countries deeply integrated with China-centered supply chains, including Mongolia as a commodity exporting country, face growing pressure and uncertainty. In this session, we will explore a number of critical questions. Should Asia double down on regional economic integration to adapt to new realities? What role can a coordinated industrial policy, shared infrastructure, and common standards play in keeping Asia integrated and dynamic? We will also consider a more sobering question as supply chain left behind from efficiency to resilience. Are export-dependent economies at risk of being left behind? So let me now briefly introduce our speakers. So left to me is Ms. Prachi Mishra, who is a professor of economics and director of the Isaac Center for Public Policy at Ashoka University at India. She has held senior positions at the IMF, Goldman Sachs, where she was India chief economist, and the Reserve Bank of India. She has also advised India's Ministry of Finance and the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. Her research focuses on international economics, macroeconomics, and Indian financial markets. She holds a PhD in economics from Columbia University. Next is Mr. Jong Kang, who is a director of the Regional Cooperation and Integration Division at the Asian Development Bank. He leads ADB's work on regional integration. Dr. Kang has held various senior roles at ADB and previously served as a director of Korea's Ministry of Finance. He also leads ADB's Asian Economic Integration Report and has published widely on trade, macroeconomic policy, and inclusive growth. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Washington. Next, Mr. Liqing Zhang is a professor of economics and director at the Center of International Finance Studies at the Central University of Finance from Renmin University and the Graduate School of the People's Bank of China. His work focuses on capital flows, financial liberalization, the international monetary system, and the Chinese economy. He has held visiting positions at institutions such as the World Bank Institute, Peterson Institute, Columbia, and Harvard. He also advises Chinese government agencies, serves on economic and industry boards, and was formerly chief economist at PwC China. Next, Mr. Andrei Radulescu is an international senior macroeconomist at the Institute for World Economy, Romanian Academy. He holds a master's degree in economics from the University of Porto, a PhD in international economics from the Bucharest University for Economic Studies, and a postgraduate from the Romanian Academy. With over 15 years of experience in macroeconomic research and forecasting, he has worked in capital markets, served as chief economist of Romania's largest bank, and conducted research spanning the global economy, Europe, and Central and Eastern Europe. He regularly speaks on international conferences and is active in several think tanks worldwide. And last but not least is Mr. Uuganbaatar Ninjbat, currently serving on Mongolia's Fiscal Stability Council, and was appointed chairman of the Supervisory Board of the Bank of Mongolia this year. He is also an associate professor of economics at the National University of Mongolia. He earned his PhD in economics from the Stockholm School of Economics and previously studied in Turkey and Austria. Originally trained as a mathematical economist, his recent work focuses more on economic policy. So we have 5 distinguished speakers, and to start, I wanted to ask Mr. Jong Kang to start the discussion and bring us the perspective from the tensions. What is the impact on the Pacific region from these global tensions? What is the impact on the region, and what possible solutions he sees, from this shock?
Okay, so thank you for having me. And my name is Jong. I'm the director of the Regional Cooperation Integrated Division of the Asian Development Bank, and our division mainly focused on analyzing the trade and the foreign direct investment dynamics in Asia and the Pacific region, in particular in the context of challenging the trade dynamics and tariff policies engaged by outside of region, what kind of impact would be there for the many various Asian economies in the region. We can think about first, the U.S. universal tariffs, which has been implemented since the April at the 10% level, with some sectoral tariffs, 25% on the iron and steel and automobiles and semiconductors, and also along with some kind of the more the drastic the policy stance. Drastic policy shift engaged by the U.S. new government by announcing the so-called reciprocal tariffs as of the April 2nd, although it has been under pause for the next 90 days or so. So when it comes to the potential impact of tariff barriers from the U.S. and other parts of the world, I think we need to think about the global value chain or regional value chain landscape, as was highlighted by the governor of the Bank of Mongolia during his opening imposed by, because if we just simply think about the direct tariff imposed by U.S., then we may just reciprocal tariffs, which was announced April 2nd, 49% for Cambodia, 46% for the Vietnam, and 36% for Thailand, 25% for Japan, and 24% Korea, among many other tariff levels imposed. Based on the GTAP-based decision modeling exercise, apparently, if the U.S. continue its policy stance in reinstating the reciprocal tariffs of up to 49% for Cambodia, for example, then apparently the most negative impact will be accruing to the Cambodia due to the highest reciprocal tariff, which was announced by the US, followed by Vietnam and other countries. But under the 10% universal tariffs, as we can estimate, those countries which have the more value chain linkages, both with US and China, such as Korea, Taipei, China, and Singapore, will be more negatively affected from this universal tariff rates. But that might not be the end of the story, because when it comes to considering the value chain landscape in the region, for example, many of the regional economies have very deep value chain linkages with other countries. For example, Mongolia has a deep forward value chain linkage with PRC, China. And then while the Lao PDL has a very deep forward linkages with Thailand and other ASEAN member countries. So when we used the multi-region input-output data table to analyze both direct and indirect impact US tariff, for example, while the direct impact will be occurring to those who will be subject to the relatively higher the reciprocal tariff, but the other countries like Mongolia, Australia, Lao PDR, and Brunei Darussalam, which have quite deep forward value chain linkages with other countries, including China and ASEAN countries, will be also quite significantly affected due to the indirect trade linkages. So, for example, Australia will be subject to the 10% 10% universal tariff rate, and also even under the reciprocal tariff rates, it will be subject to the 10% tariff rate only. But when we take into account indirect impact through the reciprocal tariffs imposed on Australia's other trading partners, then the trade weighted average tariff rate will be much higher than the 10%. So what does this mean? This means that we need to think about not only direct trade channel and the trade linkages, but also indirect trade linkages. So for example, in the case of Mongolia, where we are having this very important influential conference among ours, I think that Mongolia's impact from the tariff of the US will not only coming from the direct tariff imposed by US, but Mongolia will be also significantly affected from the trade linkages with China. In that sense, the potential trade deals and then the other kind of arrangement which might be struck between US and other trade partners will be quite important for Mongolia and other countries in the region. So we need to pay also attention to not only its own country's own trade engagement and trade deals with US, but also we need to also pay attention to what kind of trade deals will be struck between US and other trading partners with which the country has trade linkages through the indirect trade linkages at the same time. So let me stop there, and I'd be happy to talk more about what kind of policy implication this kind of the current trade landscape will have for the regional economies in the region. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. And indeed, as I've mentioned, indirect links are very important, and maybe they are not so visible from the data because they are indirect. But Mongolia is, as you've mentioned, one of the countries who will be affected by indirect linkages, because directly Mongolia doesn't trade with US that much, but indirectly via China, the impact can be quite large. That's why for the next discussion, I wanted to invite Mr. Uuganbaatar Ninjbat to speak about the implications for Mongolia, the country who is hosting us today, from these indirect linkages, and how does he see the impact flowing into the economy.
Okay, so thank you, Tigran. Good morning, everyone. I think we are already seeing the impact now, and now it has become quite clear on our data and the economic statistics, and then now it has become more clear, more evident, even in the politics arena. So people in the parliament are in the last month or so discussing heavily about the upcoming trade and budget deficit, the possibility of trade and budget deficits. And I think soon, probably next week, even in Monday, we will see a supplementary budget where the government is going to cut some of the planned spendings because they forecast about 10% of revenue decrease expected. So that's so we're already seeing the signs. So the Mongolian economy is quite, at the moment, quite simple, but at the same time, the structure is quite complicated. At the same time, and I'm afraid it's not very resilient. So that's the weakest point, probably. The weak resilience comes from the heavy dependence on the commodity export, and in particular, one or two commodities. And if you look at the data and the statistics of the past tariff, Trump's last 2 years, so he tried to he imposed 10 or 15% tariff on China, and he's very proud of its success because and I think he claims that the current policy is the continuation of this last 2 years tariff policy. Then if you look at the data of that time, then you can clearly see the linkage of a tariff policy, U.S. tariff policy, and its impact on the Mongolia comes from the commodity prices. So that's the main pass-through channel, if you wish. And then the commodity price falls down, then that creates a pressure on the export, on the foreign reserve. Which could put quite a bit of pressure on the central banking, at the same time a big pressure on the budget revenue. So that's basically the story, and I think it's going to be repeated now, and it has already started. And at the same time, Mongolia was quite ambitious for the last couple of years, and the COVID somehow benefited on the external side because there was the price boom all over the world. It affected also the commodity prices. And about that time, the COVID also revealed some of the trade-offs that we were facing, basically for many years. In the video, the government of that time tried to unlock some of the trade-offs, like the logistics, for instance. Okay, and also there was quite a bit of shadow economy in the mining sector. So they need to mine not only the coals or the commodities, but also mine the shadow economy. So they managed to mine it. But as everyone can see, the mining the shadow economy is limited because it's a constant. There is a constant amount of economy that you can reveal in a certain amount of time, and they managed to do that. But as politicians, they are quite impatient, so I have to say. And it's one of the main assumptions that economic theory tends to ignore in our model making, in our policy designs. It's a very key factor, I think, that's often overlooked and often ignored because the politicians everywhere are, first, they are impatient, so they want to do it the most fastest way, and then they look for big projects. So that's one of the key issues that we need to take into account. So if you wish, there should be something like a behavioral development microeconomics or something like that. So, but I haven't seen a good paper, for instance, on that term. So they are impatient. That's number one. Second thing that I find very puzzling among the politicians and the policy in the policy making, decision making, is that we all learn about trade-offs as like the economics 101, yeah. So that's one of the most, perhaps the most important lesson that you learn from the undergraduate education. But then we tend to forget once we finished our education that the most important thing, the idea of trade-off. So it's often ignored, and then especially in particular in the political arena. And now I'm also sitting at the Fiscal Stability Council, so it comes to interplay. Always there, it's always there. Yeah? So the trade-off is always there, but no one wants to talk about it clearly. Yeah? So that's another dilemma, if you wish, or a paradox in the policy making. So that's the second thing that I noticed, and we see it also in the Mongolian politics as well. Well, the third, and perhaps also now it's becoming more clear, is the unhidden importance of the so-called industrial policy. I think industrial policy has always been there, at least in the political arena, but maybe not well studied or well accepted in the among the economists, because in the economic literature we tend to talk more about the trade policy. But if you look at the history and the data and the practice of policy making, these two are like the mirror images, yeah? Has always been the mirror image of the two, but probably there in the globalization period, like from 80s to, I don't know, 2000, yeah? Of that, the 20 years of neoliberal period, maybe the trade policy really has become like the real the policy tool, and the industrial policy was on the backstage. The time has become less important. But except for that small period of time, I think the industrial policy has always been the forerunner, behind the forerunner of the policy making. The trade policy served only as the mirror image of the industrial policy. But now we see that there is a clear declaration of industrial policy becoming the main policy tool over the trade policy, and the trade policy is now just like a small, minor, important detail of the entire policy making, so that one can, impose tax or on all over the world in one day, like bring out the placard and then just make the announcement, So that was the shocking truth, I think, that currently we are facing with. So then that creates another question, what we should do. Maybe we should now coordinate on the, instead of trying to coordinate on trade policy, which is not the main tool now, maybe you should try to coordinate on the industrial policy. We'll talk about explicitly who wants what. Maybe that's the new, let's say, standard or new reality. Now in the case of Mongolia, we have, as I mentioned, some vulnerabilities. It's not a resilient economy. At the same time, there's another, maybe the last dilemma or the paradox that I would like to mention is about the unseen infrastructure of the economy. So it's also not very much discussed, not very much ignored. So we often tend to assume the existence of markets, for instance. But they are not there. I mean, market is very limited. It takes quite a bit of time. I think it takes a lot of time for markets to develop in itself. But if there is no market, then someone has to act, assuming the impatience, all the items listed in the agenda. So government needs to take some action. So now the government tries to become the consumer, the main consumer. So the tool that, mostly missing in the Asian economies, that the Asian economies has been criticized for a long time. So the government has to become the consumer, not only the policymaker, the consumer, the producer, maybe the market maker even, So it has many roles, and it tries to do all at the same time, but we all know that it tends to fail too often, yeah? So we know the impacts of having an ambitious government, but at the same time, I don't see much the other alternatives. So that's probably the main dilemma that, at least in Mongolia now, we are facing. So it's not government, okay, fine, then who? That's the question.
Yes, thank you. And we also see that, globally, there is like discussion now ongoing whether this shock is going to lead to less globalization in general or more like regionalization. Let's say, more trade happening, within clusters of countries, and those clusters are not connected with each other. In that context, India has been a country who has been maybe a bit benefiting from this tariff war, and now there is discussions ongoing with UK and US on trade agreements with these countries, and some of the supply chains have been rerouted from China to India. So I wanted to invite Prachi Mishra to tell us, to speak about India's experience, how India is coping in this period. And I understand there are some slides. Yes, could you please put on slides for Prachi Mishra on the screen?
Thank you very much, Tigran. Thank you, Mark, for the invitation, and Honorable Governor and all distinguished participants. Really pleasure to be here. I think it's beautiful, and it's been a delightful experience so far. So I thought I'll take about 8 minutes or so, and start very briefly on the global context. There's so many participants from the IMF, so Dr. Jong Kang already spoke about it. I'll be brief about that and dig deep into the Indian economy and the challenges which the Indian economy is facing in the current global context. This is a chart from the IMF's World Economic Outlook. I'm not going to spend time on this. Dr. Jong Kang already spoke about it. But I think it's clear, one thing that is clear is that we are really in a new global trading order, irrespective of the uncertainty and about what tariffs are likely to be implemented. I do want to shed light on this chart, which basically, so if you think about, Trump tariffs on April 9th, US tariffs on imports from China went from 20% to 34% to 125%. And come May 12th, it came down by 115 percentage points. So I think we are living in a world of very high uncertainty. I think the uncertainty is about trade policy, which you see here. Which you see right on the left chart, this is a global economic policy uncertainty index. But beyond trade policy, how should inflation react? How, there's a lot of financial markets uncertainty as well, as financial markets are trying to figure out, what the new contours are going to be of this new, global world order. And this has started feeding into the data. Mostly into the soft data, as you see on the right, particularly on the manufacturing side for the US. This is the purchasing managers indices. But the hard data is yet to reflect some of the changes we are seeing. But I think, again, one thing is clear that we are living in a world of high uncertainty. I think consumers are postponing purchases. Firms are basically piling on cash. So I think this is the real challenge. If you talk to companies, if you talk to consumers, they are not sure what is it going to look like. And probably there'll be some more clarity in the next couple of months. But this is basically the global context in which economies, particularly India, is grappling with. With this global context, let me move on to the Indian economy and give you a very quick tour of what are the current challenges we are facing, both in a cyclical sense, but also in a structural sense. Cyclically, the Indian economy is going through a slowdown, which you can see. I don't know, the pointer's not working, but I think it's, sorry. As you can see on the left chart, this is the momentum this is a commonly used measure of momentum in the Indian economy. It's declined quite substantially, as you can see. We have seen some recent pickup. But I think broadly speaking, over the last year or so, there's been a decline partly induced by policy. Because as fiscal policy, monetary policy normalized after the post-COVID stimulus, you see it partly reflected in the decline in momentum. And of course, policies, and in particular, monetary policy has begun to adjust. The Reserve Bank of India has reduced interest rates by about 100 basis points, reduced the reserve ratio by 100 basis points in the last meeting, and also injected a vast amount of liquidity. So we should, and some of it is already feeding into the pickup in momentum, which you see on the left chart. So this is the broad cyclical backdrop of where the Indian economy is. The cyclical slowdown has really been against the backdrop of a lot of structural changes which we are seeing over the last decade. And this slide is a very quick attempt to summarize some of the structural changes. There's a new monetary policy framework. There is a new monetary policy committee-based decision making. There's an IBC. India has a bankruptcy code now, so companies can actually officially be declared as bankrupt On the fiscal side, there's a goods and services tax which has been introduced, and there are other things like India has recently been included in the JP Morgan's bond index. And on the right-hand side, at the bottom, what you see is basically, some of the less talked about changes which are going on. There's a lot of, development on the data systems. So, there's, the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation is doing some terrific work by reducing lag in data releases. There's monthly employment data now, and wage data was really a big thing and one of the challenges we are facing. So this is, the backdrop of the structural reforms in India which have happened over the last decade. That said, there are a number of challenges which policymakers generally are grappling with in India, and let me give you 3 main challenges which are key in my view. Despite a lot of support to manufacturing, the truth is that if you look at the left, if you look at this figures, manufacturing as a share of GDP, this is the purple line on the top. You can see that it's been basically stagnant, and if anything, it has declined a bit, over the last decade or so. And this is despite the fact that there's been a lot of support, subsidies to the manufacturing sector. Very different is the services sector. Services sector in India is really going through a revolution, and you can see it in the blue line. Services as a share. GDP has increased really by 5 percentage points or so over the last decade. And this is the puzzle is that all the support, all the all the incentives are being provided to manufacturing, and yet the services is actually which is showing robust growth in both domestic services as well as exports. If you look at export data as well, services exports in India are truly undergoing a revolution. So this is one of the big, challenges, very relevant in the current context of Trump tariffs, realignment of global supply chains, whether India can really seize some of these opportunities. The second big challenge is that private investment in India again has been stagnant for a number of years. So private investment as a share of GDP in this picture is shown by these purple bars, which are private corporate investment, and as you can see, it's been around 10%. Overall investment has increased, but it's mostly driven by the public sector. And this is what a Mongolian colleague from the Supervisory Board has talked about. Government has basically been leading the investment drive in India over the last decade. There are some green shoots, but not yet appearing in the aggregate data. And this this stagnant private corporate investment has been concomitant with a decline in net household financial savings as well. So again, the second challenge and a big debate currently going on is who's going to fund the growth for India going forward, given India's goal of becoming an advanced economy in the next 2 decades or so. Is it going to be the government? But the government doesn't have much space. Fiscal space is rather limited, and net household financial savings are declining. So who is really going to fund the Indian growth going forward? The third challenge is actually very interesting. The third challenge is, when you think about India, India is a huge country, very diverse. It's really, the economic performance is also very diverse across the country. So here what you see is that on the left-hand side is, India's forefathers had always envisioned balanced developments, and that's why there were different mechanisms called the Finance Commission, etc., which were introduced to have a system of transfers across states. But the truth is that, as you can see in the left figure, divergence across states has actually grown over time. And on the right-hand side, what you see is actually quite interesting. Bihar, which is actually my home state, is, has a per capita income which is comparable to sub-Saharan Africa, but it's not, the highest in sub-Saharan Africa. It's comparable to, Niger, Malawi, Sierra Leone, which are, Liberia. Liberia had, gone through conflicts and civil wars. And in fact, for Bihar, which is a large state in India, on the eastern side, if you were to exclude two big cities, this would be off the charts on the right. So this is, I think, one big challenge which currently policymakers are dealing with. How to, it's important to, you cannot have an advanced India without having certain states which are very less advanced and comparable or even lower than sub-Saharan Africa. But I have to say that, amid all these challenges, there are big opportunities. I think everyone is aware India is a labor-abundant country. India is going to be young for a couple of more decades. As you can see, this is the dependency ratio. The black line in it is in India. So there is a window of opportunity for another decade or so where the dependency ratio in India is going to decline, unlike countries like Korea, China, as you can see, which are already aging and dealing with the problem of aging population. However, the key paradox is that, despite India being a labor-abundant country, if you look at the capital to labor ratio in India, that's been increasing, and it's been increasing at a very increasing pace. So it's not, despite being labor-abundant, both its domestic production and its exports are, very much increasingly becoming more capital-intensive. And this is a big, big paradox that, why should India export, chemicals, machinery, iron and steel rather than textiles, clothing, which are actually labor-intensive sectors? And that brings, me to exactly the point with Dr. Ninjbat from the Supervisory Board in Mongolia said that, there is nothing called made in India or made in Mongolia or made in the US, because we are really living in a world of global supply chains. And there is, if you, this figure basically shows, the comparison between India and Vietnam about, backward linkages in supply chains. And as you can see, there's a huge opportunity for India to get linked in these global supply chains. So this is again a big discussion in India, again, relating to what Dr. Ninjbat mentioned on, how, so you cannot have external orientation, period. External orientation has to balance with industrial policy, particularly in India, because that policy, to push labor-intensive manufacturing in India, because that is where the opportunity is. Again, I'm not going to go into details, but the Convergence Foundation in Delhi, which is a philanthropic organization, has done excellent work on, pushing, for example, the textile sector and what needs to be done, and some of it, fast-track implementation of FTAs. Some of it, India just signed an FTA with the UK. US is almost getting finalized, and EU is in discussion. But there are a number of other things, and I'm, happy to talk about it more. Again, again, integration in the global value chains. Mobile is another example. India's exports of mobile phones have really seen explosive growth over the last decade. I think one of the criticisms has been that because India is at the end of the value chain, it's basically assembling, that's why the domestic value added and the employment effects are likely to be very small. However, if you compare India and China, I think the domestic value added for a Chinese, for an iPhone assembled in China is very similar to that of India. The difference is that, China has been able to scale up. So the number of iPhone assembled in China is about 10 times more than what they assembled in India. So it's about integration in the value chains, even if it's at the at the end or the lowest value of the value chain. If we are able to scale up, then the impact on domestic value added and employment is actually going to be quite significant. Bottom line, I think really there are two windows of opportunity for India. I think one is the demography. India is still going to be young for at least another decade. The dependency ratio is going to decline. And this is a time when, you know, firms are thinking of realignment and reallocating. So really, I think the depends on the policymakers, private sector participants to seize these two opportunities. Let me stop here and would look forward to the discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very interesting presentation, and it's also interesting how, you know, some countries are trying to find opportunities, you know, to benefit from this, even though what you have mentioned that it's more like capital intensive exports rather than labor intensive can be a bit of a problem down the road because of, you know, large population in India. So, but we can talk about it a bit more later. Now I wanted to invite Andrei Radulescu to share with us his thinking on how Europe, who is also trying to get a trade deal with the US, how Europe is trying to address these issues.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for having me in this very beautiful venue. It's like Jackson Hole, and I'm very glad to have the opportunity to talk about global challenges, a vector of opportunities for European economy. Before starting, as you can see here, I picked up some mottos from my vast experience in presenting all over the world in more than 40 countries, and now today I'm adding Mongolia on this list of countries I had the opportunity to present in the recent years. And I will start with the motto, with the Chinese version of the word risk, as you can see here. And I had the opportunity to be a part of a Confucius Leaders program at Central University of Finance and Economics in the summer of 2019, before the outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic. And I learned this word risk, which is written under the form of two characters. The first one represents the real danger, and the second one the opportunity. So we are living in a period full of changes, full of challenges, full of risks, but it's also a period full of opportunities. So I hereby invite you to see what are the main risks, but also to try to identify together the main opportunities, not only for Europe, but for the whole global economy. The second motto, uncertainty is the only one certainty. The third motto, more than 8 years ago, Henry Morgenthau used to speak at the Bretton Woods Conference, the former US Treasury Secretary, that peace as prosperity, it's indivisible. I added planet. Nobody talked about planet more than 8 years ago. So from my point of view, peace, prosperity, and planet are indivisible. Last summer, I don't know what you did, but I worked on my vision to transform Europe. And it was published in Washington at the end of August, before the Mario Draghi's report. And I managed to present this vision for the transformation of Europe in several capital cities of Europe. And one of the mottos of my vision to transform Europe is that we have to put Europe back on track. From the current 3S with red color, 3S means sick, stagnant, and segmented Europe, to the future 3S with blue color. This means smarter, stronger, and more successful Europe. And we have to implement a 3S strategy. Green 3S means speed, solidarity, and safety, security. In this context, nowadays Poland is the presidency, has the rotative presidency of the European Union, and the main topic during this first half of 2025 is security of Europe. And we have to increase the convergence in Europe and to do more business with outside Europe. I'm not going to focus on several slides that you have the opportunity to read after this very important conference. I'm just going to focus on several charts. First of all, I'm going to focus on the fundamental change of trust in the world in the recent months. And you can see here, my colleague from India talked about the significant increase of the uncertainty. And we have here the economic policy uncertainty index in the United States with the red line. I would like to emphasize the fact that in the month of April 2025, the level of uncertainty in terms of economic policy in the US outpaced the level of uncertainty in the month of April 2020, when we had the first wave of the coronavirus pandemic, the worst health crisis in the world in more than 100 years. But following the Liberation Day, you can see the significant depreciation of the United States dollar. This means the fundamental reallocation of trust in the world in the recent months. especially determined by the so-called Liberation Day. Moving forward, it's not the only one elephant in the room, because as you can see here, I estimated for this conference the real financing cost in the long run in the United States. So the real financing cost on 10-year maturity in the United States, and you can see the fact that the trend component of this indicator, it's nowadays very close to the highest level since the beginning of this century. And this is a very important risk factor for the dynamic of the global economy in the short run. Moving forward, this chart is very representative for the current race, global landscape. It shows that Europe is the loser of the global race. If you look at the beginning of the 90s, when the Treaty of Maastricht was signed, you can see the fact that the share of the GDP of the European Union in the global economy was very close to the share of the US economy in the global GDP. Meantime, you can see the downward trend for the share of the European economy in the global GDP, and in the recent years, this share was very close to the share of China in the global GDP, but the share of China in the global GDP has been on a significantly upward trend, and this trend is going to continue in the coming years, and very likely by 2045, the nominal GDP in China is going to be higher than the nominal GDP in the United States. Very important for the current landscape in terms of trade, in terms of world trade, because you can see here that foreign trade had a positive contribution to the growth pace in the European Union. So I estimated here the compound annual growth pace for the components of the GDP for the period 1995 to 2024, period 1998 before the launch of the euro to 2024, and period 2009 when we had the outbreak of the great financial crisis in Europe, and 2024. So basically you can see the fact that the volume of the exports rose by higher pace on average than the volume of the imports. For all these three periods under analysis, and mentioning the fact that after the outbreak of the great financial crisis, we had a significant increase of the gap between the pace of the exports compared to the pace of the imports. And this is very important because over the past quarters, especially after the outbreak of the crisis in Ukraine, we had a significant deterioration of the international competitiveness of the European Union. And I put here the dynamics of the volume of exports in the Eurozone. Eurozone contributes by around 85% to the GDP of the European Union. And it's a significant divergence, a contraction of the volume of the exports of the Eurozone, exports of goods, compared to the significant increase of the volume of the exports of goods in China, and with the consolidation of the volume of the exports of goods in the United States. For instance, for the 2024, we had the contraction of the volume of exports in the Eurozone by around 2.6%, according to the data from the Netherlands Bureau for Economic Policy Analysis. And this is divergent compared to the increase by around 13% in China, 13% in China, and with an increase by around 2.6% in United States. Moving forward, you can see the fact that we have a huge gap in terms of openness degree, with the openness degree in European Union being around 97% last year, is significantly higher compared to the level in China, slightly less than 40%, and to the level in United States around 25%. If the trade is not working, who is suffering the most? It's the industrial policy, because the industrial production is related to the dynamics of trade. And you can see here the huge divergence between the largest economies in the world in terms of the industrial production, with the contraction of the industrial production last year in the Eurozone by around 3%, stagnation in the United States, and increase in China by 5.7%. Moving forward, I estimated, because we are living a period of, how to say, unprecedented challenges, unprecedented changes, but also unprecedented risks. And you can see the fact that we have to go back to the roots to understand why the European Union is the loser of the global race. And I estimated here the trend components for the annual pace of the GDP, gross fixed capital formation, and exports in the Eurozone. You can see significantly downward trend for the dynamic of the exports, total exports in the Eurozone. Actually, you are talking about the annual pace at a record low level. And also we can see the deterioration of the annual potential pace of gross fixed capital formation to the lowest level since the beginning of 2013, when the Eurozone entered the post-crisis cycle. And if we apply the Cobb-Douglas production function, you can see the fact that over the past years, we had a negative contribution of the multi-factor productivity to the annual pace of the potential output in the Eurozone. So European Union should be restructured, we should implement significant structural reforms. Some of these reforms have already been, let's say, started at the beginning of this year. For those that were in Davos Economic Forum in January, the main perception was that Europe was dead, that only the United States existed, especially after the speech of Donald Trump. But many things happened in Europe, especially the implementation of the competitiveness compass, the start of the REARM EU program, and of course the acceleration of the launch of the project, Savings and Investment Union. And in this context, if I have time, only 5 slides, very briefly, because this is my vision on how to transform Europe that was presented in many capital cities in Europe over the past quarter. So first of all, Europe should invest more in R&D. You can see the fact that the R&D expenditure in GDP, it's around 2.2% in the European Union. It's significantly lower compared to 3.6% in the United States and 2.6% in China, while 3.4% is the level in Japan. But also, this talent that should be generated in Europe should be encouraged to stay in Europe and work in Europe. So Europe has to increase the human capital begins today. Second, we have to increase the digital competitiveness. We are living in the middle of the revolution of artificial intelligence and also in the middle of digital revolution. You cannot be competitive in the long run unless you accelerate the incorporation of the technological progress. And you can see here significant gaps in terms of the digital competitiveness index among the countries in the European Union. The second motto of this vision, we are what we consistently do. 25 years ago, when China joined the World Trade Organization, it was a famous saying at all top conferences in the world. That saying was, US innovates, China fakes, EU regulates. In 2025, this saying is different. US and China innovate, and Europe continues to regulate. That's why the European Commission, at the beginning of this year, end of January, they launched the competitiveness compass in order to cut the regulation burden, which is estimated above 1% of GDP. But it's not only about the quantity of regulation, it's also about the quality of regulation, because as you can see on this chart, we have a significantly low level of quality of regulation in Europe, at least compared to the most, let's say, the top countries in terms of this index in the world, and the best one is Singapore, as you can see here with the green line. Moving forward, it's not only about regulation, but it's also about financing costs. And despite the fact that over the past decades, the monetary policy rate in Eurozone was lower compared to the monetary policy rates in the United States, we had a significant gap in terms of market risk premium. With market risk premium in Germany is the largest economy in the European Union, with a nominal GDP of 4.3 trillion euros last year. So market risk premium in Germany over the past 2 decades was higher than the market risk premium in the United States by an average annual level of 2 percentage points. So despite the fact that monetary policy rate was lower in the Eurozone, the market risk premium was higher because Europe lacks a capital markets union, a project that was launched after the great financial crisis but hasn't been implemented. Moving forward, always remember that the work is not finished. And Europe has a lot of things to do in terms of green transition, despite the fact that is the economy more advanced in terms of transition towards green economy. You can see the fact that there are many countries with a very low level of alternative energy as a percentage of the total energy consumption. And then you can see the significant gaps in terms of development of capital markets in Europe, with countries from Central and Eastern Europe with a very low level of capital markets development. And this is why it's very important nowadays to have an integration of the capital markets, but also we need an integration of the energy markets in Europe in order to accelerate the green transition and to cut the cost of energy. Opportunities arise every day. You can see the deterioration of the European competitiveness over the past decades through this chart, with the share of the European Union exports in the total exports down from around 19% in 2002 to less than 16% last year, while the share of European imports of goods in the global imports of goods down from more than 70% in 2002 to around 14.4% in 2024. And if we look on this chart, we can say that Europe was the balance of the unbalanced world over the past decades. And last year, Europe had a record surplus in terms of trade with goods with the United States, around 197 billion euros. But also, on the other hand, on the flip side, European Union had a record high deficit in trade with goods with China of around 300 billion euros last year. And last but not least, nothing endures but change. You can see the fact that economic convergence in Europe is not a one-way highway. We have years with increasing convergence, and this means downward standard deviation for the contribution of multi-factor productivity to the annual pace of the potential GDP, followed by years of increasing divergence, especially after the outbreak of the global shocks. Global shocks normally have a symmetric impact for the countries in the European Union, but asymmetric consequences, because there are countries that can deal better, there are countries that have higher resilience when the shocks hit the continent. And last but not least, and this is very representative for the gap, the increasing gap between United States and the Eurozone. You can check the data from the Federal Reserve. I put here GDP per capita in Eurozone as a percentage of GDP per capita in United States expressed in nominal dollars, not at purchasing power parity. And you can see the fact that last year, GDP per capita in the Eurozone represented 54% of the level of GDP per capita in United States. I repeat, in nominal dollars. This is the lowest level back to mid-80s when Jacques Delors activated all the policymakers to start, let's say, the project of single market. And the single market project is the best asset of the European Union. This is the matrix I propose for the transformation of Europe with annual targets for the most important indicators. First of all, Europe should increase labor productivity by at least 1% every year. In the United States, in the long run, so over the past 3 decades at least, the compound annual growth pace of labor productivity on average was 2%. In Eurozone was less than 0.8%. So we have to accelerate, let's say, the measures in order to stimulate, to increase the labor productivity. The second point, to increase the share of digital economy in GDP, which is over 40% in China, it's less than 20% in the United States, and it's less than 10% in the European Union. European Union cannot be competitive in the global landscape in the middle of the artificial intelligence revolution and digital revolution unless it increases the share of digital economy in GDP. Not to talk about R&D expenditure, I already mentioned. Also, we have to develop the capital markets, which are very fragmented, and that's why the market risk premium in Europe is higher compared to the market risk premium in United States. And last but not least, because also the governor of Central Bank of Mongolia mentioned in the opening speech, we have to improve the communication with the stakeholders. All good and bad things happening in the world economy are determined by the communication, by the way the policymakers are let's say, interacting with the stakeholders. And last but not least, as Churchill said more than 80 years ago, we have to fight on all fronts and never surrender. And I see a big potential of putting back on track Europe, because now is the moment of Europe, also emphasized by the leaders of the policymakers institutions over the past months. And I think Europe can be, how to say, very competitive in the future global economy, especially when it comes to asset management and also when it comes to complexity of bioproducts, aerospace, health, and tourism. Unless we implement and we change the structure of Europe, Europe risks to be the greenest museum in the world in the next decade, but a museum that needs foreigners to visit, to pay the tickets, and for Europeans to use the revenues to pay the bills. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much for having me. And I am available for questions with great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Indeed, very interesting presentation. A lot of policy issues, big agenda for Europe. And, traditionally Europe has been strengthening its integration from crisis to crisis historically. So let's hope this crisis also offers an opportunity for further integration and tackling like the impact of the shock. So far we were mostly focusing on, trade aspects of these international shocks, and now I wanted to ask Mr. Liqing Zhang to tell us more about the financial aspect, which is, the other side of the coin. In particular, how these trade tensions can lead to maybe more internalization of Chinese yuan currency for global trade, and as Andrei mentioned, dollar has depreciated after Liberation Day, and there has been some flight of capital, and then there is a discussion that China may step in now and open up its market, and from financial point of view try to have more internalization to fill in the void. So what are your views on the financial aspect of all these developments?
Should I use this? Okay, thank you very much for having me here. Good morning, everyone. I think I need another one, right? Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. And I'm mainly a finance economist, but since this session mainly focused on trade issues, so let me briefly touch two issues. One is about the possible trade landscape in the future, and then I move to the monetary issues and finance issues. And for the trade issue, we are obviously living in a very special area, which mainly challenged by the U.S. trade policies, and we most likely in the coming years we will have to stay with the highest tariff rates over the past 100 years. As previous speakers mentioned, that this is really challenges, and but how will the trade landscape in the future looks like? And let me introduce points made by a well-known trade economist, Rich Baldwin. He actually, in a recent report, made 3 possible scenarios to the future of trade landscape. One is, although multilateralism would be heavily weakened, the regional agreements, WTO rules, and the related measures will still play some role, so that a waning economic globalization may continue. That is the one scenario. Second scenario is continued geopolitical friction would lead a further fragmentation of global trade into some competing economic blocks, maybe 2 or maybe more, like the period of the Cold War in the last century, 1950 to 1970s. This scenario means that the WTO system will be weakened further. The third scenario, he said that economic globalization may continue, but the process will be going without US. American first eventually will lead to American alone. The new alliance formed by China, EU, ASEAN, and maybe Global South continue to promote economic globalization. strengthening cooperation in new areas, such as sustainable development, and strive to maintain, strengthen in the WTO system. In this case, very likely this progress will be going without United States. Personally, I believe that the first scenario is possible, and I guess is relatively good, or even best, compared with the other two. The second one is also possible, but probably the worst. The third one, I think it's impossible, because the US does not really want to be isolated by the rest of the world. He only wants to de-risk, particularly de-risk from other economic powers like China, because we have a very different system ideologically. I think basically the Trump 2.0 is based on political purpose. Raising tariffs will not solve U.S. current account deficit, because it is U.S. deficit is mainly due to the low level of saving rate. It will not solve the government revenue and debt problems, because if the tariffs are high, too high, lead to a significant reduction, will lead a significant reduction in imports, and total tariff revenue will also fall. It cannot solve the problem of return of manufacturing, because the labor costs is in the United States is so high. So in fact, the purpose of China economic policy is really politically based. It only wants to de-risk from the rest of the world, particularly from China. So I think basically the second scenario is most likely, and but economically it is not very good, because it will lose efficiency for the whole world. Also, it created some so-called national security in the United States. I don't know for sure whether it is for sure. And so let's try the first scenario, but we have to prepare for the second scenario. Let me briefly move to the second issue, that is what is the future of the global financial and monetary financial system? Will the so-called Bretton Woods system really end soon? In the mid and around time, the end of dollar-centered international monetary system seems to be inevitable. So it's inevitable, right? The future would be multipolar reserve system. That is quite for sure. But it will, I think it will take time. In the near time, the United States, the dollars will still dominate the international monetary system. Why is that? I think there are a couple of reasons. One reason is that the US dollar is still based on a relatively strong economy in the United States. Although the GDP share in the world, GDP significantly declined compared with the situation in the 80 years ago. At that time, almost over 50% of the GDP in the United States in the share of global GDP. But now it's declined to like 26 or 27. In the future, it could be declining further, but it will take time. Secondly, as I said, Trump does not really want to be fully isolationist. The criticism of multilateral system, such as IMF and World Bank, given by its Minister of Finance in last April, in the annual meeting of IMF and the World Bank, obviously means that United States still want to dominate the international financial world. It will never give up its dominance, at least intentionally, in the finance world. And one more thing is that the stay-at-home may change the future of the international monetary system. And so far, the U.S. has a very extremely strong advantages in this area. And the advantage of stay-at-home may create more chance for U.S. to issue more government debt in the future. So this could be a supportive force for the United States to keeping its relatively strong dollar status. A little bit was on Chinese currency. Over the past 16 years, RMB internationalizing has achieved remarkable results overall, although with some fluctuation. In the past 2 years, the progress has been relatively good in terms of the proportion of payments and the trade finance. Now China has become the second largest trade finance countries, and the proportion of payments in the global payment system is increasing gradually. After the Russian-Ukraine war, RMB internationalization actually has found more chance because the weaponization of the dollar hurt U.S. dollars confidence, and the launch of RCEP and the restructuring of the global value chain have expanded trade with China and ASEAN. This actually promoted the use of RMB in these areas. And further, international financial turmoil in some areas, like in Latin America, has created more chance for PBOC to provide currency swap and play more important role in the global financial safety net. Of course, for having a more important role in the global financial system, RMB internationalization will will have more support from many sides. One is China need to keep a strong and sustainable economic and trade development in the future. Second, China should accelerate its reform in the financial sector, particularly strengthening its treasury market and increase its openness. China should provide more liquidity to the rest of the world, provide more safe access to the rest of the world in order to have more chance to internationalize its currency. And I would say that more opening capital account is probably the most important condition for the internationalization of renminbi. But for many reasons that China cannot open its capital account fully at this time. So maybe the most important way recently China can take is development offshore RMB market. This could be more realistic choice. Finally, I think China should try more actively do something in the stable core industry. It should have more active attitude towards this innovation. Otherwise, I think China's currency internationalization may face new challenges in the future. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very deep and insightful discussion. And indeed, depending on how the global economy continues, whether it will continue the globalization or will split into different blocks, I mean, all these aspects regarding also financial flows and international monetary system will depend on that as well. So we'll need to continue monitoring the situation. So we are running out of time, and I have myself lots of questions, but I want to give a chance to audience. So I wanted to open the floor for questions and answers. Please feel free to ask any questions you may have to our speakers. And I hope there are mics available. Yeah, here, mics. Please. Yeah, sir.
I have one question to person on Europe and one question on China. About Europe, you showed German and US premium, right? And then German, I think German premium was higher than US. I think one of the chart you mentioned, the premium, this premium. Okay, so could you elaborate more why Germany has a higher risk premium? Because in Europe, it's one of the lowest, right? So if we can explain. Another question to China, I'd like to know what's happening to, I don't know whether you mentioned about CBDC Enbridge experiment. How effective is it? Is it going to help internationalize Chinese currency? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for the question. Market risk premium is a quite abstract indicator. It is estimated, and it takes into account how to say, the real cost of financing in the economy. And the fact that the market risk premium in Germany is higher compared to the market risk premium in the United States, and it was significantly higher over the past decades, is mainly determined by the fact that the level of development of the stock market, because the European corporate financing is more dependent on financing from the banking sector, while the US corporate financing is more dependent on financing from the capital markets. And the cost of financing, when you put an intermediate, the banks between the companies and the markets, automatically you pay a higher cost than in the United States, where the companies go direct to the market to attract the financing needed for their investments. But hopefully with this savings and investments union, hopefully in the future, also with the digitalization of the economy, we are going to see, and this is my, how to say, my outlook, that by the end of next decade we are going to see a unique capital markets in the European Union, because what is happening nowadays is not sustainable. The corporate Europe, it's paying higher financing costs compared to corporate America. The corporate Europe, it's paying higher energy costs compared to corporate America. And the corporate Europe, it's confronted with weaker labor productivity compared to what is happening in corporate America. So these three factors, structural factors, are a drag for the competitiveness and for the performance of corporate Europe compared to the performance of corporate America. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your excellent question. In my view, the CBDC has been giving the central banks hope that the central bank can play a very important role in the digital time. But as I found that CBDC has faced really challenges, maybe for two reasons. One is that BIs has withdrawn, you know, that probably because of the Russia's intention to join the bridge in some way. So without BI's participation, I think Enbridge will face really challenges. Although it will continue, but it can it will not go so smoothly, I think, at least in the near future. And another challenge coming from the so-called stablecoin. Personally, I think stablecoin seems to have more bright future in it, because as you know that United States has just announced a regulation, and also Hong Kong decided to allow the pilot scheme of stablecoin of Hong Kong dollar. And actually, my observation is PBC also has shown more interest in stablecoin. So if stablecoin developed faster in the future, I think there will be a very limited chance for CBDC. So probably in the future, these two can go, you know, together. But it seems to be that stablecoin has a more bright future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Governor, you had a question? Yeah, okay. Ladies first. Yeah.
If this is so, thank you to all the panelists for really, really good discussion. I have a question for Dr. Mishra. I was intrigued, very nice presentation. I was intrigued especially by this performance of services versus manufacturing in India. And one of the things I picked up on was that manufacturing has received all this support from the government. And I wondered if that's not, it may not be sort of a question of despite the support, but maybe because of that support, manufacturing in India has not been forced to innovate. You know, this is sort of the monopoly type of argument where you know that you're going to be, so you don't have to work against. And you know, services by contrast, so like Blink and Ola and all these, you know, very innovative services in India have been forced to come up with these things on their own. And could that be an explanation? And in some ways, manufacturing, almost by definition, you know, they're tradable. So this is a statement about being not competitive on the world markets, where services is a little bit different, right? They are almost by definition not tradable. Just some questions to put.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mithali Das. I think this is an excellent question. I don't know whether Mithali was, you know, I think audible to everyone, especially at the back. I think her question is that, you know, I showed a chart in India where the share of manufacturing in GDP has been pretty much stagnant, while the share of services in GDP has in fact exploded. And I showed GDP, but if you look at exports as well, the share of GDP has exploded. And I made the point that, look, I think all the support has actually been to manufacturing. India, you know, has a big program called PLI, Production Linked Incentive Schemes, to support manufacturing. And Mithali's point was that is it, you know, what I said was despite the support to manufacturing, you've seen services grow. She made an excellent point that it may not be despite, but it may be because of the support that manufacturing has got. You know, it's making firms less competitive, and it's making, you know, not forcing them to innovate. And I think my answer would be absolutely. I think that perhaps is one of the reasons. But the performance of manufacturing in India is, you know, a complex mix of a number of other reasons as well, which includes regulation, and there's a big push by the government to deregulate, you know, get out of the way, deregulate. And I think in Europe we heard about the need for deregulation. 98% of firms in India are micro enterprises. So I think it's a complex mix of you know, support and protection, deterring firms from innovating. But beyond that, you know, I think high regulation, you know, financing costs, particularly for smaller companies, you know, general business environment. So it's I would say that, you know, definitely that's one of the factors, protection, or in the form of subsidies or other forms of protection. It's really a complex mix of a number of factors which may have contributed. We are seeing green shoots. A lot of discussion in India, actually firms, Foxconn, you know, relocating in India to manufacture iPhones, but yet to figure in the aggregate macro data. So thank you very much. This has been very interesting discussion. Given that there are no questions, I'll take the opportunity. Mainly, you know, it was been, you know, very diverse set of presentation, but I was really intrigued by, you know, Andrei's presentation on Europe. And what I really liked in your agenda is these annual targets. You know, you had these nice slides. My question for you, and, you know, mainly I want to, you know, what would be the accountability and the enforcement mechanism to implement, you know, the annual targets which you set out?
I will send you also the article that was published in Washington on 26th of August regarding my vision for the transformation of Europe. This is the title, Transforming Europe, a Vision from the East. Now it's working. Thank you for the question. So I will send you afterwards the article that was published in Washington on my vision to transform Europe, transforming Europe, a vision from the East, on 26th of August. And this is the day when I presented in the front of Business Community of Europe in Brussels. The accountability and the implementation of this matrix, 1 to 10 points, would be dependent on the launch of an agency responsible at the EU level for these very important structural indicators that European Union economy has been, let's say, has presented and has underperformed over the past years. And also in my vision that was published before Mario Draghi's report, I proposed the launch of a fund at 3% of GDP, because we all talked here about the role of the government in investing in the economy in this fragmented world, in these unprecedented challenges. And I propose, if you read the Stability and Growth Pact that was launched almost in 1987, almost 30 years ago, the spirit of the Stability and Growth Pact is that the governments in the European Union should have balanced budgets in the mid-run in order to have maneuver room to go with the budget deficit to up 3% of GDP in the times of crisis. And that's why I proposed a body to implement these targets, but also to implement up to 3% of GDP for public investments in the European Union. Draghi mentioned investments around 800 billion euros. Now we have the ReArm programs, at least 800 billion euros. Now we have the ReArm Euro program that it's going to implement huge investments for the security of Europe in the coming years. We also have the programs for public spending, public investments in Germany. Germany wants to implement investments, public investments of 1 trillion euros in the coming years. 1 trillion euros, it's around 25% of the nominal GDP of 2024 of Germany. So a body to implement this matrix, and very important to focus on the quality of regulation, not only on cutting regulation, because nowadays what makes the difference among performance of economies is the quality of entrepreneurship, is the quality of the investments, is the quality of talent. So there are examples of countries in the European Union. If you look at IMD International Competitiveness Index 2024, top 30 most competitive economies in the world, 11 are member countries of the European Union. So it's possible to be performant and to have a high level of competitiveness while being member state of the European Union. Creating a body to implement the matrix and public funds, EU public funds of up to 3% of GDP. And it's very important, Europe has resources. After each crisis, Europe changed the agenda, changed the, governance model. But every time it didn't manage to implement all the changes in terms of governance. We don't have the banking union finished. We don't have the capital markets. These are projects launched after the great financial crisis, so more than 10 years ago, more than 15 years ago. These are not finished. After the outbreak of COVID, European Union launched the Next Generation EU program. You know that the effective rate of the implementation of this program, which is scheduled to be finished next year, so in 2026, is very low. There are countries in the EU that not even attracted €1 from this Next Generation EU program. So Europe has resources, the problem is implementation, and take into account this fragmented world, Europe needs political union. Europe needs to increase the integration, Europe needs to go further, integrate the energy markets to decrease the cost of energy, integrate the capital markets to decrease the cost of financing, and improve the economic diplomacy. European Union is a project of peace, it's not a project of war. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for one last question, please. Here.
Thanks. That's a very interesting discussion from all of you, but I have a particular comment on Europe. The last crisis in Europe happened around 2009, 2010. It definitely was not used as something to solve and go ahead, as we've seen in the data, especially in Andrei's presentation. And we should not therefore talk about Europe being able to use each crisis to its development.
Never lose a crisis. Ask a question. Oh yeah. I have a question for our European friends and Asian country friends. One of my friends called Win Tai Wu, he raised a proposal that given the Trump tariffs friction, he proposed that EU and Asia should unite, probably form a new union. So as a response to the Trump tariff shocks. So anyone want to make some response?
Thank you very much indeed, Professor. I had the opportunity to have many times presentations in China. The latest one was in Ningbo, end of May, so less than 1 month ago. And I also had many or hundreds of presentations in Europe in my career. You recently saw the visit of the President of the European Central Bank in China, and if you take into account the recent developments, you are going to see many, many visits of EU top officials, top representatives to China in the recent quarter. So taking into account that from the trade balance point of view, European Union is running a huge deficit with China. This is, from my point of view, a huge opportunity for further developing the relations in order to go to more intra-industry trade, in order to address this problem of huge trade deficit, which last year between European Union and China in terms of trade with goods was around 300 billion euros. It's the largest deficit European Union is running in terms of trading partners. But it's also an opportunity for European Union and China to move forward in terms of the fact that there are both regions promoting peace historically. They are both soft powers and not powers. So it's a huge potential conference, further cultural exchanges, for further people-to-people exchanges, and conferencing in all main domains in terms of science, starting from aerospace, digital transformation, financial markets, development, because there are many common points between these very important blocks in the world, and these trading blocks are also very important for the future of the world. And if we take into account that the higher growth space in the world are in Asia, we are living in the Asian century, as a former, let's say, famous professor from Singapore said. And on the other hand, we have very low growth spaces in Europe. It's an opportunity for Europe to improve trade relations and to be more active on the Asian markets, from my point of view. Thank you.
So I think that the Asia-Europe economic relationship partnership is very, very crucial and very much important in support the global economic community, and then the trade relationship, the trade growth and promotion. At the moment, I think that already much is taking place. So, for example, the Korea-EU FTA, the Indonesia-EU FTA, and also India recently struck a deal with the EU for the economic partnership agreement. But the thing is that based on our own analysis of the free trade agreement, where the Asian countries are being member, I think what we have found based on our analysis, based on the so-called structure of the model, is that the trade promoting effect of the FTAs Asian countries are engaging in is much more limited than those for extra regional the FTAs. What does this mean? This means that the depth of the commitment, concessional commitment, is much shallower for the FTAs Asian economies are embracing, and also the scope of the membership is much more limited for the Asian FTAs. So the Asia versus the narrow EU FTA and the economic partnership agreement will address at least the part of the narrower scope of the membership of the FTA. But the thing is that how deep the economic relationship can be forged between the Asian and the economic union countries. For example, the program itself is, cited the examples of RCEP and CPTPP. Compared to CPTPP, the degree and the depth of the commitment through the RCEP is much more narrow and shallower. For example, the RCEP does not recognize the full diagonal rules of origin. I mean, the cumulative rules of origin among the member countries. This limits potential economic integration impact among the RCEP member countries. So likewise, how deep and the broader economic partnership in the relationship can be forged through the free trade agreement or economic partnership agreement between the Asian countries, the EU countries, that's something that we need to think about in the future. Thank you.
Just take 1 second. I think this is a great point. I think in principle, I think Asia-EU agreements, and which are already happening, India is negotiating a trade deal with the EU, but Asia is very diverse. You know, as you know, India didn't sign up into RCEP, and you know, every country in Asia is at different points of the value chain. So to think about, you know, first of all, I think to get the Asians to agree between themselves and negotiate with EU, I think that, to me, is a bigger, you know, the bigger challenges for within Asia agreement on a broader level. I think that, to me, is a you know, bigger challenge than individual countries negotiating with the US or the EU.
Another point I'd like to add is that engaging in the FTAs and the free trade agreement with other trade partners should go hand in hand with promoting domestic reforms. For example, I think that the clear reason that there are concerns about had to withdraw from the negotiation for the RCEP was because of their concerns about the huge influx of imports, in particular from China, in case they open the market through RCEP. Then the thing is that how to improve and strengthen the competitiveness of the manufacturing sector before they open the market through free trade agreement. So in that sense, international economic policy should go hand in hand with the domestic policy reform and the competitiveness enhancement efforts through the policy measures. Yeah.
Take one
Thank you.
you know.
I'm sorry. His point is some kind of unification between EU and ASEAN, the 10 country, not separately with some Asia country, ASEAN. So how do you comment that? Do you have any comment?
I have one comment on that, because the one clear example, prior example is ASEAN plus one FTA, right? ASEAN with the ASEAN with the PRC, ASEAN with Japan, ASEAN with Korea, and also at the same time there are bilateral FTAs between Korea, Indonesia, and other ASEAN member countries. Through bilateral FTA, they can go deeper into some concessions and market access concessions. So those two kind of different approach can go hand in hand between the broadening the scope of the membership and deepening the level of the commitment. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, I'm reminded that time is up. So I would like to thank again our panelists for their thoughtful contributions. So let's give them one big round of applause. We can continue the discussion, you know, like on the sidelines, but thank you very much. And let's now proceed to the coffee break. Thank you.